November 1999, there was a bill introduced in the legislature of New Brunswick to commemorate the Holocaust each and every year as it occurs on the Hebrew calendar. New Brunswick was not the first province in Canada to have such a bill. We were second. The first was Ontario. In due course, every province in Canada had a similar bill, as did our federal government, and in each and every case, those bills were passed unanimously. When the bill was introduced in the New Brunswick legislature, my wife and I were not in New Brunswick. But we knew that the bill had been introduced, and we followed its passage in the House with keen interest. And one morning at breakfast, my wife said to me, "You know, people in New Brunswick are probably asking themselves, why do we need a bill to commemorate the Holocaust in New Brunswick? It didn't happen in New Brunswick. And many New Brunswickers went and fought the perpetrators of the Holocaust, and many of them did not come back. So why do we need a bill to commemorate the Holocaust in New Brunswick?" Well, that's the question that I want to answer and tell you why I believe it was important. And the best way I can do that is to tell you a bit about my early history. I was born in March 1938 in a small town in southwestern Poland, Tarnow. Tarnow at the time had a population of 56,000. 26,000 of those were Jews. It was probably the most evenly balanced town in all of Poland. So I was 1.5 years old in September 1939 when the German war machine crashed into Poland. And I would have been about 5 years old in 1943 when the Nazi assault on the Jews reached its full fury. And I was 7 years old in January 1945 when we were liberated by the Soviet Red Army. So what do I remember? Well, overwhelmingly, you have to appreciate that my memories are not the memories of an adult. They're the memories of a child. I can't tell you that this event preceded that event or whether it followed it. But I do have some vivid memories, and I want to share a few of those with you. Overwhelmingly, what I recall is fear. And this was not the kind of a fear that you might experience if you're driving and somebody pulls out in front of you and you have a terrible panic for a moment, but then it passes. Our fear was constant, unrelenting, never-ending. We knew that the Nazis intended to murder every Jew they could lay their hands on. It was only a question of when, where, and how. The Nazi murder of the Jews in Poland at that time proceeded in the following way. They would gather Jews from small villages and outlying areas and bring them to larger centers. Tarnow was one of those. So the Jewish population of Tarnow actually swelled from 25,000 to 42,000. And then, presumably, when transport was available, they would gather Jews and take them down to the train station, where they would be packed into cattle cars and taken to the death camps, where they would be gassed and their bodies would be burned. Those occasions in Polish were called wysiedlenia. In German, they were an Aktion. I recall during one such wysiedlenia, I was being held in my father's arms. There is a prayer that Jews recite if they consider death to be imminent. And so I asked my father repeatedly to recite that prayer with me so we would go to heaven. What concept does a 5-year-old have of heaven, earth, life, death? I don't know. But on that day, I expected to be killed. And if that was the case, I wanted to go to heaven. My father kept count. And after the war, he told me he had recorded it. And on that day, we recited that prayer 36 times. I recall being in my grandfather's apartment. Why I was there, how I got to be there, I have absolutely no idea. My grandfather was an observant, pious, Orthodox Jew. While I was there, 2 Nazis came in and they ordered him to go with them. He lived in an upstairs apartment. That's a bit of an exaggeration. It was a single room. He stood up immediately and he picked up his prayer bag and tucked it under his arm. That prayer bag would have contained his prayer shawl, prayer book, phylacteries, and he went with them to the head of the stairs. And when he got to the head of the stairs, he must have annoyed them, because one of them pushed him or kicked him, and he fell down the stairs. And as he fell down the stairs, they shot him. For the last 2 years of the war, we were hidden behind a false wall in the attic of the flour mill. And I recall vividly the night we escaped from the ghetto. My father brought my brother and I to the ghetto wall. My brother was 4 years older than I. He managed to get up to the top of the ghetto wall by himself, but I was too small to be able to do that. So my brother pulled me, and my father pushed me, and I got to the top of the ghetto wall. It was the winter time, there was snow outside. Poland has much the same climate as Canada. When we got to the top of the ghetto wall, my brother pulled me over and we fell into the snow and we crouched. And as this was going on, we could hear shots being fired. Other Jews were trying to escape the ghetto. And of course the ghetto was surrounded and patrolled by Nazis, guards, and if they spotted a Jew trying to escape, they shot him. Towards the end of the war, the Soviet Army, the Soviet Red Army, at that point carried out their operations in that they would have an offensive, they'd go so far, then they'd stop, re-equip, resupply, and start another offensive. The Soviet Red Army came close to Tarnow, and they stopped. And we wondered whether we would make it, whether we would survive and be liberated or not. And every day seemed like an eternity. And then one day, that last offensive, the one which took them right to Berlin, started. And early in the morning, Soviet soldiers appeared in the streets of Tarnow. And they were in white camouflage, moving about the streets very cautiously. It's difficult, if not impossible, for me to describe to you the feeling of joy and relief and jubilation at seeing the Soviet soldiers and realizing that we had survived and our huge nightmare was finally over. So we rushed out to greet them. And several Soviet soldiers came to the flour mill. The flour mill was actually located on the main thoroughfare from Lvov to Krakow. So that was the one they came through, and some of them came to the flour mill. When we rushed out to greet them, I got to the head of the stairs, and I stumbled. I was very weak, and I hadn't walked on stairs for 2 years, so I probably had forgotten how to do it. And I fell down the stairs after I'd taken a few steps. And when I got to the bottom of the staircase, there were 3 Soviet soldiers that were standing there. I put my arms around the boots of the Soviet soldier closest to me, and I kissed his boots. It strikes me that when events get to be very big, when numbers get to be very big, they lose all meaning. If I tell you that a cup of coffee out in the hall is $2, you know exactly what that means. If I tell you that a car costs $20,000, you know what that means. But when people start talking about billions and trillions, what does that mean? It's a big number. But it, you know, how do you focus on it? There are so many things about the Holocaust which to me are incomprehensible. And the fact that the Nazis killed 6 million Jews, how do you focus on that? 90% of the 3.5 million Jews who were living in Poland in 1939. Half the Jews of the world of that time. But how, you know, it's a big number. How do you get your mind around it? Well, let me share 2 stories that for me allow me to focus on that number. In Hamburg, Germany, the Nazis were carrying out experiments on Jewish children, so-called medical experiments. They had taken 26 Jewish children from France. And something like 10 days or 2 weeks before the end of the war, they decided they could see what was coming, so they decided to destroy the evidence. They took the children down to a cellar and they hung them from hooks. The perpetrators were caught. They were judged in Nuremberg. One of them said that the children didn't even cry. And another one said that some of them were so weak that their weight was not enough to break their necks, so they had to pull on their feet. I'm going to read to you the names of 3 of those children. Jacqueline Morgenstern at the time was 12. Leah Kligman was 8, and Manja Altman was 5. I've tried this several times. It takes me exactly 15 seconds to read the names of those 3 Jewish children murdered by the Nazis. The Nazis murdered 1.5 million Jewish children. And if I was to read their names for 8 hours a day without stopping, it would take me 290 days to read the names of the Jewish children murdered by the Nazis. The other story that brings the numbers into focus for me concerns Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal, famed Nazi hunter, was working as a slave laborer in a German hospital. And one day, a guard came and said, "Come with me." Wiesenthal thought that he was going to be shot. It was random, it was arbitrary, there never were any reasons, but he wasn't. And they took him into a room where a young assessman was lying, grievously wounded, and obviously about to die. And this assessman had asked to talk to a Jew. And that Jew happened to be Simon Wiesenthal. So there was a nurse there, and she left, and the guard left, and they had sat Wiesenthal down by the bed of the Nazi, the young assessment. And now this assessment told him his story. How they had joined the Hitlerjugend, how proud they were, and how they worried that the war would be over before they could show what they could do. But it wasn't. And one day, they found themselves in a village in the Ukraine. And they gathered up all the Jews and crammed them into a house. And he told Wiesenthal there was 150 or perhaps 175. And he couldn't believe that you could jam so many people into one house. And he described to Wiesenthal the look of fear on the people's faces, and how they made some of the men carry cans of gasoline into the house. And when they had them all in, they locked the doors, they surrounded the place, an officer gave an order, there was fire, they threw grenades into the house, there were explosions, there was fire, there was smoke, and from an upper story window, a man and a woman and a child jumped out. And the man was shielding the face of the child with his chest. And when they hit the ground, they shot them. And now he asked Wiesenthal to forgive him. When I read that story, I thought to myself, try and imagine the fear and the anguish of that man and that woman and that child, and then think to yourself, in one form or another, this happened 6 million times. So what did the Holocaust mean to me personally? I want to show you a few pictures. Okay. I wonder. Now, in the year 2001, the flour mill where we were hidden was torn down. They discovered our hiding place and they called in the Tarnow Museum. And most of the pictures I'm going to show you are from the Tarnow Museum. This was actually the workshop associated with the flour mill. And this is the attic, and this is a portion of the attic where we were hidden. Next one, please. So this is the false wall that I talked to you about. And this was our living quarters. There are some utensils here, which I think we must have used when we were in hiding. There were 9 of us in this hiding place. The next one, please. This is the back of our hiding place. That wall actually belongs to another building. This is that false wall. In this area we could stand up, in the other we could not. The next one, please. This is Mr. Adam Bartosz. He's the director of the Tarnow Museum, and he's illustrating the entryway into our hiding place. We obviously chose it in the smallest area, so if somebody came up into the attic, they would not see it. The next one, please. This is, of the 25,000 Jews who had lived in Tarnow prior to the war, 700 survived. Most of those had escaped to the Soviet Union. Some had survived the camps. The ones that survived somehow found the will and the energy and the courage to build a monument to those that had perished. The monument was built at the Jewish cemetery in Tarnow. These children are the ones that survived. There were 8,000 Jewish children in Tarnow. These are the ones that survived. That boy was my brother, and this boy was me. Next one, please. This is the new synagogue in Tarnow. The first synagogue was built in Tarnow in the year 1460. It took 63 years to build this synagogue. 2 weeks after the Nazis came to Tarnow, they destroyed all the synagogues. They burnt them down. It took 3 days for this synagogue to burn down. What was left over, they dynamited. The next one, please. This is the Jubilee Synagogue in Tarnow. This area is known as the Bima, the central location from which prayers are recited. The next one, please. This is the Bima as it is today. This cupola was built by the Tarnow Museum because the Bima was disintegrating. There are no Jewish structures in Tarnow. There are no Jews in Tarnow. This is the only Jewish structure left. After the war, we lived in this building. And I recall looking out and seeing that bima, and there were wild weeds which were growing out of it. And somehow that seemed appropriate to me. Next one, please. This is the bima from another view. This is the building that we lived in. The next one, please. This is Żydowska ulica, Jews Street. These cobblestones were not there in 1939. These are the cobblestones that were there in 1939. In June of 1942, the Nazis gathered several thousand Jews in the town square, which was the highest point in the town. They tortured them for a couple of days, then they murdered them. And the blood flowed down the streets, and then they called in the fire department to wash the streets down. In Tarnow Museum decided to preserve some of the cobblestones that were there then. Next one, please. These are those cobblestones that were there in 1939. And you don't see it in this slide, but there's a plaque that the Tarnow Museum installed above those cobblestones. Next one, please. This is a map of Tarnow as it is today. So it is larger, obviously, than it was in 1939. This is the ghetto. This is where they crammed 42,000 people into. And this is Lvovska Street. That's the street that the flour mill was on, not far from the ghetto. And that's the street that the Soviet soldiers came down on. Next one, please. This was actually made by the Gestapo. The Gestapo building was right there. And this is the ghetto. And this was done during the Nazis' reign in Tarnow. You'll notice that the ghetto is subdivided into 3 sections. After they killed off so many Jews, they decided that the ghetto could be smaller. They made it smaller. And when they killed off some more, they made it smaller yet again. So that the final ghetto was this. The next one, please. These are now my personal pictures. My mother had 5 brothers and sisters. My father had 8 brothers and sisters. But we have no mementos, no pictures, no documents about my uncles and aunts and grandparents on my father's side. Only those on my mother's side. So this was one of my aunts and her husband, and they were married a week or 2 before the war. They were murdered by the Nazis, but we don't know where or when. The next one, please. This is my mother, and one of her brothers, David, and one of her sisters. David actually survived the war. He was in a concentration camp. There was a man who was in the same concentration camp, and he came and told my parents that David had survived. They were liberated by the Americans. The Americans were very kind. They gave him too much food. His system was too far gone, and he died 2 or 3 days later. The next one, please. This is another one of my aunts, one of my mother's sisters, and her little boy. I estimate that he would be less than a year old because he can't stand by himself. They were murdered by the Nazis, but we don't know where. And the next one, which is my last slide. This is my grandmother and grandfather on my mother's side. That's the grandfather that I saw shot. And that's it for the pictures. And if we could have the lights. So that brings me full circle. And it brings me to Washington. I expect that most, if not all of you, have been to Washington. And if you've been to Washington, you know that it's a very beautiful city. And it's not just the political capital of the United States. It is a cultural center as well. And there are many museums in Washington. The Smithsonian alone has something like 56 museums. And each and every one of those museums is devoted to the achievements of humanity in art, in literature, in music, in science, in technology. In 1993, the United States opened the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. It took 10 years to build that museum. And many people ask themselves, why do we need a Holocaust museum in Washington? A museum, unlike all the others, which records the depravity of humanity, the disintegration of civilization, the perversion of technology. The Holocaust didn't happen in the United States. The Americans fought the perpetrators of the Holocaust, and over 400,000 of them did come back. So why do we need a Holocaust museum in Washington? Michael Berenbaum was the first chief curator of the Washington Holocaust Museum. And he wrote a book describing all the holdings of the Washington Museum. And he was well aware that that question had been asked. And on the last page, in the last paragraph, in the last sentence of that book, he answered that question. And here's what Berenbaum said. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum reminds each of us how fragile democracy is and how vigilant we must all remain in defending the core American values, indeed the core human values of individual dignity, social justice, and civil rights.